Hi everyone, thank you for your patience. We'll wait just a couple seconds to make sure everybody gets loaded in on this new live stream. Anyway, this is kind of a work in progress, so I think you'll enjoy maybe a little different format tonight with, instead of it just being me, it being Jason and I together. And so you can enjoy the conversation that we have on our Bible text for tonight. So hopefully everybody can hear now and that we're in good shape. Are you getting any feedback yet?
All right, I just see where people are watching. Give us a thumbs up. Let us know that you can hear us okay. That way we can make sure that that this venue is working.
Yeah, it's
or this way. Okay, everybody's giving thumbs
good.
Up and
okay.
Good deal.
You can actually hear us now, so that's good.
Good.
All right, welcome everybody. I think we'll start tonight with a few announcements, and then we have a Bible discussion that Jason and I will be doing here in just a few moments. The Golden Years class is going to be canceled until further notice. We're working on an alternate plan for the egg hunt, so you can be looking forward to that. More information will be coming. Anyone, if you know someone who is in the need of assistance, maybe you have a friend or neighbor, someone from our congregation that we don't know about who could use some help, be sure and let us know about that. If you'll email the church office, that'd be wonderful. We will not have our 5th Sunday potluck this month. At a time, let's see, we will have individual communion packets available. It's the little cups that has the bread on the top and the fruit of the vine underneath. We have those available here at the church office. Be sure and come by to pick those up. And also, we're not, during this time, since we're not assembling, we're not passing the collection plate and taking up a contribution. So if you'd like to mail in your contribution to P.O. Box 757 or bring it by the church office, then that would be great and give you an opportunity to participate in giving. I have these announcements on our prayer list. Bob Brown is still in the hospital with complications due to his cancer treatments. Michelle Carroll, she broke her leg and she's been released from the hospital, and Billy is taking care of her at home. So be sure and check up on them, make sure that they don't need any encouragement and help. Betty Honey is having some health issues. Be sure and call and check on her. Lila Natel had called me to tell me that her great-grandson has been born just as a few moments ago. So we rejoice with her that has gone well. Janice Taylor is recovering from hip surgery, and Ann Warren is recovering from a broken arm. That's the announcement that I have for tonight. And so I think it'd be good for us, if you will. It's like everybody's on board now, so let's begin with the prayer. Our Holy Father in heaven, we thank you for every opportunity that we have to approach your throne, to pray to you, knowing that you love us, that you hear us, that you care for us. I thank you, Lord, for the opportunity we have to meet in this unique forum online, to gather our thoughts together, our prayers together, to focus upon your Son Jesus and to adore him and to join our hearts together to give him praise. I pray, Lord, for these who are on our prayer list, that you will be with them, you'll see to their needs, that you will bless them and comfort them in ways that you can do, that we can't. So we cast them before you, and that you'll love on them and take care of them. I thank you for the opportunity we have now to study from your word and to be joined together to learn and grow. In Jesus' holy name we pray. Amen. Before we actually get into the study, I want to thank everyone for your interest in me and taking care of me during this time I've been quarantined. And I got out around town today. It was really nice to be out. It was really nice. I have Jason here with me tonight, and we'll enjoy some fellowship together now in study of God's Word. I've chosen tonight for our text, John chapter 13, Jesus washes the disciples' feet. And I'm going to read the text, and then we'll let Jason begin with a few comments. John chapter 13. It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "A person who has had a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. And when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. And now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." So let's just begin by getting your first impressions of the text. What are your thoughts as you listen to these words?
I'll tell the audience what I told Steve earlier. He was trying to kind of prompt me, kind of give an idea of what he might be asking, and that was, of course, the question. And my reply was, I don't know what to say because I'm afraid that what I want to say will take about 30 minutes to say it. Typical for me, right? So here's the thought. As we were reading through, verse 7 really jumped out at me because if we try to put ourselves into the place of the disciples, whether that was a James or John or Peter, does this make sense? What I'm doing, you don't realize now, but afterward you will understand. There's no way that they completely understood exactly what Jesus was doing. And even for us, now that we have the full Gospel of John, and even greater than that, all four of the Gospels telling us this gospel story about Jesus, we may not fully and completely get the picture of what's going on here. I like to take a look at the kind of the big picture of things. That, of course, would probably take us about 3 weeks looking through the whole Bible. But shorter than that, just looking at the Gospel of John. So John chapter 13, here is a new scene. This is a new day. Since John seems to be writing his Gospel as if he is recreating the creation week, the signs that Jesus performed, 6 of them before the cross and the resurrection. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. A lot of creation week language there. But in the very beginning, so in the beginning was the Word, and then he describes the light came into the world to expose the darkness, and the darkness could not overcome it. And then you have the life and times of Jesus all the way up to chapter 12. So this is the public ministry of Jesus. And then it concludes on this point, I have come as light into the world, chapter 12, verse 46, so that everyone who believes in me would not remain in darkness. If anyone hears my words and doesn't keep them, I do not judge him, for I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. Then the one who rejects me and doesn't receive my sayings has this as his judge. The word I have spoken will judge him on the last day. And so Jesus ends his public career using word, just as John began in chapter 1. So the word this is Jesus. This is his example. What he shows to us, he is presenting to us God himself. And he is also presenting to us the type of life that we should live. And that is to be a light into the world. And so when you start with chapter 13, now things are going in the direction of the cross. And what is interesting about this is that Jesus is shown as light and Judas is shown as darkness. Whenever he leaves, he goes out into the darkness. And so whatever we see about Jesus in this story is not only projecting us forward to the cross, but is showing us this is who God is. And so I think that's kind of the main thing that I see in this story, is that Jesus is saying this is who God is.
Yeah, I like the fact that you pointed out that for the first 12 chapters we have Jesus' public ministry. And now there's a real shift, and you can feel it as you read through the book of John, that now things have become very personal. And now Jesus is spending these very intimate moments with his disciples. He has them alone. He asks them intimate questions. He reveals deep truths to them. He encourages them with his love. And this event would have been so shocking to them. It had been life-changing that here is Jesus, the Son of God, now in this intimate setting, going and washing their feet. And you told me that you had some foot washing experiences you did with the youth group, and how uncomfortable that those can be. You know, there's the touch and the humility that's all a part of that.
Right. So yeah, I mentioned to Steve earlier, when we went on our first mystery mission trip back a couple of years ago, this was the one where we went out west to Navajo Nations. One of the last nights, as a part of living out the story, the guys gathered around in, it was the Navajo house, the Hogan, or however you pronounce it. And for the devotional that night, I washed their feet. And it was just, it was such an awkward, but humbling experience. For the person that was doing the washing, which was me, and then for all the other guys that were there as well. And even one of them, when I came, "You're not washing my feet." And so I told them, I said, "If I don't do this, then you have no part with me." So, but that was just kind of the awkwardness of it. But yet it was such a touching moment. Here we were inside of this Hogan, dirt floors, just a basin of water and a towel to dry with, making that close personal contact. You think, feet, that's something, you shake hands with people, you hug people around their shoulder, you can kind of push off on people, rub elbows, fist bump. But washing feet, that's something different.
I'm always struck by the beginning setup that John gives us into this event by speaking of the attitude of Jesus, and as he approaches this moment when he's going to show them, as the NIV says, the full extent of his love. It shows all the things that prepared him for that moment. His confidence in his relationship with God, his heart being filled with love, his pride that's not existent. He's there in complete humility. He's willing to step into this servant role that was uncomfortable enough, as Jason pointed out, that Peter objects to it. It's just beyond his ability to comprehend and to allow to happen. So if you notice these words, it says in verse 3, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, that he had come from God, and that he was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. You can see that Jesus knew who he was, he knew what his purpose was, and his overwhelming love for his disciples is shown in this action of service. And it's not beneath him. It's something that he does because he's confident in his relationship with God and secure in that. I'm curious about this statement, Jason, that says in verse 2, the evening meal was being served and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Can you imagine the moment that Jesus had when he came to Judas's feet and what that would have been like?
Oh, and that's the thing is that, so to give you a picture as well about this scene, is that not only do you have this intimate connection with his disciples, Judas including, later on, whenever they begin to ask, who is this that's going to betray you? John leans in close, and I can kind of see, they're reclining. So try to imagine a low table with pillows around. They're reclining. They're reclining at the Passover because, reclining is a sense of freedom. And that's what the Passover was all about. It was about freedom. And so when they partook of this supper, they partook of it as free people, which was really kind of a slap to the Romans because the Romans were oppressing them. But he says, the one that to whom I give the bread that's been dipped, he is the one who betrays me. That's what he tells. And I can imagine John leaning in on his chest and Jesus saying this, and only John hears this. The others don't really hear what Jesus is saying. But that symbol of taking the bread and handing it over to somebody was an act of intimate friendship. And if you know the story, when they come to the garden and Judas brings that strange mixture of soldiers and priests out to see Jesus, Jesus calls him friend, and then Judas kisses him on the cheek. And so it's, there's a tension there, and it's hard to imagine. So much of everything that's going on is filled with this tension that just seems so upside down and backwards. And I think the gospel writers are simply telling us that this is something you've never seen before. This is something you've never heard of before. I mean, you see, Jesus tells his disciples to go find a place, and they'll know to find it because there's a man carrying a pot on his head. That was unheard of at the time. There was, in Mark's account, in the house of Simon the leper, she came and anointed Jesus' body for burial before he was even dead. There was Mary, according to John chapter 12, the first of the chapter, Mary lets down her hair. That you did not do that in the presence of men. And so you have all of these things going on that are basically, here's what, prim and proper and power and authority and everything that we think of that is supposed to be true and right in this world has now been just flipped over. And so a lot of this, even today, we have a hard time making sense of it.
Well, you mentioned the fact that Judas that in the midst of this supper, the disciples began to ask each other, well, who would do this? And Luke comments on this in Luke chapter 22. It says, they began to question among themselves which of them it might be who would do this. And just on the heels of that comment, we have this argument or this dispute that comes about. Maybe it was over the seating arrangement, who's going to sit closest to Jesus, who is the greatest. And Luke says a dispute arose among them as to which of them would be considered the greatest. And Jesus said to them, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who is at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. Why study this during this time when we're apart? This is an opportunity for us to show the world what it means to be great. Not according to the definition of the world and how the world defines and lives out greatness, but the way Jesus defines greatness. In my mind's eye, it's at this time when they're having this dispute that Jesus settles the dispute by getting up, wrapping a towel around his waist, and washing their feet. And in doing this, he shows them this is what the kingdom is like. This is what greatness is. It's devoid of pride. It's devoid of being puffed up, of selfish ambition. It's about serving others and letting God receive the glory for it. So I think it's such a powerful moment. Then to begin the teaching section that he begins in chapter 14 where he teaches them, he's really set the mood just right for it.
Something that, as far as the scene goes, something else that maybe we might miss. I don't know, you have probably picked up on this. But this is giving us a projection to the cross. And if you notice what Jesus does, Jesus basically he changes clothes. He takes off a cloak and wraps a towel around him. The next time that Jesus changes clothes, it will be whenever he is mocked in front of the soldiers. And they place a robe around him, and then he is presented before the crowds by Pilate, saying, "Behold the man." And of course, with the cries of the soldiers, "Hail King Jesus," or "Hail King of the Jews," "Hail King of the Jews." And so, basically, this is a picture, you might say a type of the crucifixion that is to come. And so when you think of Jesus, and the Luke passage that Steve read earlier is paralleled in Mark chapter 10, and that's when Jesus, the discussion was about James and John wanting thrones on either side, and Jesus told them, the rulers, that's not the way it's supposed to be with you. The first will be last. The greatest of you will be your servant. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to give his life as a ransom for many. So to give his life was the greatest act of service. So you think of, in order for Jesus to be the greatest of all, he must be the least of all. In order for him to be the first of all, he must be the last of all. And this picture of service that Jesus says we can demonstrate is the picture of the cross. And so we see Jesus now tells us this is what power, this is what authority, this is what reign in the kingdom of God looks like. This is what the kingdom coming to earth as it is in heaven looks like. It's his people in lowly service, even to the point of going to the cross.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate the comments that you have been giving us. Jim Johnson writes here, in our world we have accepted the definition of humility as a passive activity. No bragging, quiet, sitting back, Jesus' example of humility was active, standing for something and serving others.
Yeah,
It's great.
Yeah, Jim, you made me think about a quote that I saw today, and if you saw my Facebook feed, then you probably saw it. This is a quote from John Climacus. I don't know how to pronounce that last name. He's probably dead, so I guess it doesn't matter. Humility is the only thing no devil can imitate. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was a wonderful quote. And it just happened to show up on my feed with a picture of Jesus washing the disciples' feet today.
You kind of began, Jason, with verse 7 that says, Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." This kind of expression of greatness is so counterintuitive. It doesn't really make much worldly sense. We think of greatness through self-promotion, through achievement, and the things that kind of the world promotes. And so really it was going to be something that the disciples were going to have to grow into in their understanding, as are we. You know, we have to realize greatness is achieved not through self-elevation. It is achieved by serving others. It's getting your hands dirty by washing someone else's feet. And although right now we're in a quarantine, social distancing age, we can serve one another by just loving on each other from a distance, if you will, by serving each other, checking up on each other, giving expressions of love to one another, and to realize that in doing so, we are displaying the kind of humility that Jim talked about is a very active one and not just sort of philosophical, but something that's very real.
And I think we see a picture of this in this story as well in Peter. So when he comes to Peter, why was he last? So Jesus has washed all the other disciples' feet, and so you kind of get this feeling of preeminence. Kind of reminds you whenever they were asking, who is greater. Later in John 21, Jesus will ask Peter, "Do you love me more than these?" I think he was saying, "Do you love me more than these disciples?" And I think Peter is, like he said when he said, "These may abandon you, but I won't." And so you kind of get this attitude of Peter that, well, they may do something, but I will do something else. So you have this kind of pride about Peter that Jesus is trying to teach him. And then he says, "Listen, if I don't wash you, you have no part with me." Which is the same as saying, if I do not die, you do not live. And so he's telling Peter, you need to sack the pride.
You guys that have heard me preach over the last 18 years know how important it is to me that the Bible presents people just as they really are. With all their flaws. We see a lot of ourselves in Peter. He's a pretty flawed guy. Yep. He speaks when he should have been quiet. He says the wrong thing when he should have said something different. And so we can see ourselves in those moments being the same way. But pride is something that we all, as a part of the human experience, have to learn to deal with.
It's the attitude that says, I'm too good for this. Or it's even an attitude that says somebody else will take care of it. And so we need to check our hearts anytime that, and of course every day is an opportunity, but anytime that an opportunity avails itself, we need to check our hearts and make sure that if we're not participating, if we're not offering to serve, that it's because we're just not in a position to do it. Or is it because I'm too good for that? And that should never be the attitude that is Christ-like. That should never be our attitude.
I have this quote which I think is pretty good. It's about pride. Pride is a prison that perpetuates anger, hurt, and foolishness while keeping at bay the restorative effects of conviction, humility, and reconciliation. In Proverbs 16:18, God tells us pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. very appropriate to this conversation that Jesus is not just telling them the keys to greatness in humility, but he's showing it to them as well. I'll read a couple of other comments that have come across. Appreciate you all's input. Floyd Cox says, if God in the flesh did something so lowly, the example is set for us to serve one another, even if it is only small acts of service. Gwen Youngblood has written, humility is a low view of one's own importance, humbleness, just a simple, insignificant person. And the great thing is that the more we are humble, the more that God is glorified. And that's really our goal anyway. It's for us to do humble acts of service, following Jesus' example, and in doing so, he gets the credit for it, which is where it should be anyway. It's with God. Jesus makes it clear in this text that he is setting them an example that they are to imitate. That not only is this something that comes intimately from himself, but this is something he did to show them what they were to go and do. So we as disciples then imitate what Christ has showed us here. You can't get any more clear than this. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. And now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I've done for you. That's pretty clear that Jesus wants us to serve in this way.
And if you could take a book of the Bible and say that was Jesus' Bible, it would be the book of Deuteronomy. And so I thought of when listening or reading this today, I thought of Deuteronomy 10 at 17 through 19. I won't read it because I don't have it in front of me. But basically God says, you take care of the fatherless, you take care of the widows, you take care of the foreigners, you show no partiality because you once were foreigners in the land of Egypt. And it was God telling his Old Testament people, you do unto others as I have done unto you. And so it was this model, that pattern. It's very difficult to do. And I know I struggle with it. And I'm sure you know that you struggle with it too. Following a pattern is tough, and the reason why, and I'll use this as a picture. This is what came to my mind. Our boys grew up getting Lego sets, and there would be instruction manuals of how to put together this ship or this car or this house or whatever. And when you open up the instructions, you see pieces that are going, and you think, how is this going to turn into that?
If it's like me, you end up with a lot of pieces left over at the end too.
And that's what I think is so hard, is because Jesus gives us a pattern of how we are supposed to live individually and together as God's community, a better place for the world. And we look at the example of Jesus, and he said, this is what the kingdom's supposed to look like. And you can't help but think, but this is not the way I learned it in the world. This is not the way I learned it in business. This is not the way I learned it in education. This is not the way that I was raised up to understand economics or anything. And it's so different. But Jesus says, just trust me, follow my pattern. And then later he says, basically to this effect, if you follow this pattern and you love one another, people will know that you are my disciples.
Mm-hmm. That's great. That's a great point. I have a couple other comments that have come through. Nathaniel Smith says, there is an example of the dinner guests. One sits at the head of the table, and when the host comes with another guest, he asks him to step aside for the guest of the higher importance. Oh, the embarrassment. So true. Gwen comments here, as we lose ourselves in the service of others, we discover our own lives and our own happiness. And Larry Keener says, Jesus doesn't ask the question until he's washed all the feet, 24 feet. I picked this passage for us to look at tonight, not because we are not good at this. I've picked this passage because I want us to be great at this. I think we do a good job of serving one another, but we just need to be reminded that this is what sets God's people apart. It's so different than the world that it's shocking. So let's go shock the world with the Bible's definition of greatness. And that is this absence of pride, this humility that leads us to our knees in serving other people, that Jesus can be glorified. He ends this section in verse 17. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. There's a great blessing for the one who's serving as well. And not only is it something that blesses the person being served, but there's a great blessing for the one serving as well.
Yeah. Actually, you bring up a point. I think it's good for us to mention, and I guess it's going to fall back on Peter. We're hard on Peter, but we learned so much from him, though. We shouldn't only be gracious in our giving, we should also be gracious in our getting. And so, like right now, I know that there are several people calling around, checking on you. There are people sending text and messages saying, is there something that we can do for you? Accept that as a gift and give people the opportunity to serve. Give people the opportunity to wash your feet. I say that metaphorically, but if someone would like to run an errand for you, yes, it's okay for you to say, no, I've got everything that I need. I don't want you to think that you're sinning or anything like that. But it's possible that maybe we can check ourselves and make sure that I'm not turning people away because of my pride. And we might just be giving somebody an opportunity to follow in Jesus' footsteps.
Mm-hmm. One other last comment here. In verse 16, he says, I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. And I wrote this down. This is from John Gill's commentary. If a master condescends to perform such an action, much more may the servant. Jesus is saying, I'm the master. If I do this, how much more should the servants be willing to wash one another's feet? It's a beautiful example for us. Any closing thoughts you have?
Well, the only thing else that I thought, I never had paid attention to this verse, but there's a passage. It's in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 10, where it's talking about the care of the widows, and that's the context itself is something else that can be studied, but something that comes out in that is that there were widows who were known for several things. And all of these things are listed together as acts of service. One of those was foot washing. That's a good work. They brought up children. So caring for not only for children, but for others that might be missing something that they need. They've shown hospitality. Hospitality can be in your own residence, or hospitality can be something that you, where you take something of yours to be able to give to another. Help the afflicted. So, there may be people right now that are sick, that not with the virus, but they certainly need to be taken care of. Maybe they need meals. They were devoted to good works. But here's the thing, and it was back in verse 6. The widow that is displaying all these good works is held in contrast to somebody who is self-indulgent. And so that is a picture of not just pride, but greed. And I think if we find ways to serve others as Jesus served the disciples, when we participate in those acts, it helps to push aside the greed that is in our heart.
Mm-hmm. I thank you all for joining in tonight. Appreciate the good comments. I encourage you to go back through and read the comments that you've given to each other. I'll do that as well. And I want to invite you to tune in again on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock. You'll be back with just yours truly. And I'm thinking that if you like this format, then on Wednesday nights it will be myself and a guest. And then on Sunday mornings we will just do a Bible study that I'll be presenting to you. So I hope you've enjoyed this format. Jason, I've enjoyed discussing these passages with you. Let's go out and show the world what it means to be great. And that is to imitate Jesus' humility and his service. Let's just serve one another. In doing so, we have shown the full extent of what it means to love someone. You want to lead us in a closing prayer?
Absolutely.
All right.
Everybody, we love you. We appreciate every single one of you. And I know Steve believes this with all of his heart. We just love our Northside family and so thankful that we have each other.